Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching our rolling coverage of the G20 Summit as it begins an hour, almost approximately 40 minutes from now. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, has already reached Bharat Mandapam. A set of meetings is scheduled through the day. We're bringing you all that live coverage here on News 9. With me in the studio are my colleagues Kartik Malhotra, Krinshakumar. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning,
Lovely visuals coming in from the national capital this morning.
Absolutely, and I think, this is pretty much the culmination of what India has been preparing for the last 1 year. It's been almost exactly a year since India took the presidency of G20. Obviously a historic weekend, this one, unforgettable in many accounts when it comes to the whole global leadership descending upon India. In fact, yesterday we had Prime Minister Narendra Modi in conversation with US President Joe Biden. And we believe that some breakthroughs have been made, especially on the long disputed, long-standing pending issue on the WTO trade talks, and this one coming on account of finally that dispute settling in, on the poultry products produced. So that is, of course, something that India and US have finally been able to advance their discussions on and have arrived at a breakthrough. But I think most interestingly, it's this entire artificial intelligence and semiconductor pact which India and US are looking at closely partnering on. And let's look at the statements that have come from NVIDIA, partnering with Reliance Jio as well as with Tata Communications, and really trying to build this AI infrastructure in India, which...
It's interesting, the timing of it is interesting. We know that this is a precursor to what's going to be more extensive talks between the two countries. Also, perhaps after that important India's Prime Minister's visit to the US, where some announcements were made, some money was promised, some technology transfer was promised. All of them looks like it's coming to some fruition.
Absolutely, Shweta. So I think some sort of conclusion there on the kind of investments that were committed by Micron and by Allied Microchips back in Applied Materials, I beg your pardon, back in June when Prime Minister Modi was visiting US. Now, those investments are taking shape. Add to that, NVIDIA making this commitment to build the AI infrastructure in India, which is going to translate across the broad AI cloud development, AI servers, data centers, all of that coming in. And of course, big statements coming even on investments when it comes to other US-based semiconductor companies. In fact, two of them committing to invest as much as $300 million and $400 million each to further bolster this whole AI push. And you mentioned timing. I think the timing is really critical given China's absence. And we've seen the kind of, Cold War between China and US when it comes to this hot subject of semiconductors.
Absolutely.
And neither wanting to share their technologies or their investments, bilaterally. And it gains even more prominence given the fact that US heads for elections next year. And we know with the advent of deep fakes and with the advancement of, of these great semiconductors, how deep fakes could be something that, that the world can latch on to and how misinformation can be spread. So it is squarely in China's interest to not let the Democrats come back to power next year. And it is in India's interest to try and see how the Democrats stay in power next year, because if tables were to turn next year in the US, I think the impact on China would be extremely positive and the impact on India not as much.
Right. So it is in India's interest, of course, to ensure that there is a continuity in leadership in the US. But all of that, of course, conversation happening on the back of that G20, the mega G20 summit that India has been preparing for, a host of meetings of finance ministers, of central bank governors, working groups, and all of this culminates into one big meeting of G20 leaders. All of them have flown in from different parts of the world. Yesterday, as we were on the show at about 8 o'clock, Rishi Sunak was in India. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had arrived, Japanese PM had arrived, and a host of leaders continue to arrive as of today. But let's also quickly take a look at what's on the agenda. I'll run our viewers through what to expect in a couple of minutes from now. Now, Prime Minister was, of course, expected to arrive at Bharat Mandapam at 9:20. He's arrived about 20 minutes prior to the schedule. At 10:30, the first session which is One Earth, will begin. Remember, there are 3 sessions. So, One Earth, One Family and One Future. All throughout today and tomorrow, 3 sessions will bring together leaders from different parts of the world, and there'll be series of deliberations, discussions. There will be a window for meetings between 1:30 to 3 p.m. Session 2, which is One Family, starts at about 3 o'clock. At 4:45, there'll be a fresh window for meetings, and at 7 p.m. there is a gala dinner hosted by the President of India, Draupadi Murmu. All of that, of course, it's going to be a very action-packed day, Krishna.
Right, the right way of putting it is this is the great geopolitical song and dance. That's what these summits are all about, because just how important song and dance are for Bollywood films and Indian films. These things, albeit not actually moving the actual story forward, are yet very, very important in the larger scheme of things. And the fact that India is hosting the G20 presidency. You were talking about the Bharata Mandapam. It is just being made for, just before this G20 came about. I'm thinking 20 years down the line, when you look at the Bharata Mandapam and you look at the fact that that beginning was made today by inviting the entire world to the Bharata Mandapam, it will stand out. This day, this moment will stand out 20 years from now, when India would have become even greater, probably the most dominant global superpower. It's the way hopes are, fingers crossed. But that beginning would be made today. Let's be honest about what the G20 is. G20 is a lot about the face that you put up to the world and the conversations that you start. A lot of talk about the final communique. Last time at the G20 Summit, the final common communique, the final statement took 3 days. There was no consensus. Ukraine war is going on. There is no Russia. There is no China. Yes, these kind of problems will happen in any global platform, any global fora, forever. There's going to be conflict in the world, and these summits.
You can't build consensus with as diverse a group as a G20.
Yes, the thing is that the consensus will be eventually reached in bilateral talks post these G20 summits.
So,
and if you see what's happening, Biden coming to India, having that meeting with Modi ji, and talking about all the important things that Kartik spoke about, semiconductor, defense, and the UNSC seat. That conversation, bear in mind, begins in G20. Nothing might be achieved with this G20 summit, but that conversation will continue eventually with Biden and with the US when we want to discuss trade with them. So then trade and defense will become 2 important bargaining points for India to get something out of when we do that bilateral. Just talking about Biden came to India. He had a bilateral meeting with Modi ji, and unlike usual bilateral meetings, this one takes place in Modi ji's house.
Okay.
And apparently, the White House is complaining that some of their journalists who came with the entourage of Biden weren't given access to this particular meeting between Biden and Prime Minister Modi at Prime Minister Modi's residence. Why residence when there's a G20 summit happening?
Okay.
So, you have to read between the lines when it comes to G20 summits. Yes, the larger skepticism about the fact that almost nothing gets actually achieved in the summit remains, but I am hopeful that conversations begin. If UNSC seat is achieved for India in a year's time from now and the conversations begin today, serious negotiations begin today, I'd be happy. I'd be hopeful.
I think, the way I see it, it is essentially, if nothing substantially is achieved on paper, if there are no bilateral talks resulting in bilateral trade agreements, there's at least going to be India asserting its soft power at a global stage. And, yesterday, I think Rakesh Khar was here on the show and he said something interesting, and it stayed with me. About 10 years ago, it was about taking India to the world. Now it's about bringing world to India, which has been achieved, albeit a lot of challenges here that we want to discuss. But let's also quickly first talk about that bilateral meeting that happened between Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister. What all was discussed? What's in the making? Could there be a possibility of a free trade agreement?
So, I don't know. I think, free trade agreement is something which may or may not come through. In fact, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of UK, yesterday issued the statement saying that free trade agreement between UK and India is not happening right now, at least not at the G20 summit.
At least won't be rushed at.
It won't be rushed at. And I think every country will have to look at their own inherent national interests before going ahead and hurriedly signing any sort of a free trade agreement. Now, I think coming to what are the headlines emerging from the meeting between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi yesterday? Krishna mentioned, I think the #1 headline item there is that the US is going to back India to arrive at that permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Now, again, US unilaterally supporting India does not cut it, especially at a summit which does not have the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping in attendance.
which opposes India's
which opposes India's
candidatures.
stand, right? Which completely opposes India's stand. I think it is also important to note that US and the West in general has not been very happy with India trying to, find this way around the US imposed sanctions on Russia and continuing to import Russian oil. But given the fact that India is the host country, given the sort of, diplomatic niceties that will have to be at play, I think those are not issues that are going to create some sort of a rancor in the meetings that happen. But I think US siding with India for that permanent seat at the UN Security Council definitely is headline number one. Headline number two is coming by way of this joint collaboration between the US and India, both on account of artificial intelligence, investments being made by US corporations in India, partnerships with Indian corporate houses to create this entire infrastructure ecosystem around artificial intelligence, backed by semiconductors, which power up this artificial intelligence revolution, is, I think, number two on the headline list. Now, add to this, of course, the entire trade deals which are getting signed between US and India. The seeds for this were also sown during Prime Minister Modi's visit to US in June. And finally, some sort of a clarity coming on the partnership between, let's say, the GE engines, which could be jointly developed, manufactured in India with Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, HAL, which would power up the Tejas aircraft. The Hunter drones, something that India has been vying for, asking for. We don't have indigenous drone development capabilities yet. So, some sort of movement on that is something that, again, the two countries decided upon and did go ahead with. So, I think broadly, these are areas of convergence right now. Areas of divergence would also surface. One, of course, being oil and oil import, right? Or trade settlement that India does in INR versus dollar.
Right.
Many experts say that is not on agenda. That is not on agenda. But you mentioned soft power. I think India will try to at least exercise soft power to influence some sort of discussion around trade settlement in INR.
And
it's not going to happen with US, it's unlikely to happen with UK or Germany, but at least the smaller countries, when we talk about their size of the economy and their contribution to world GDP, I think some of the smaller countries, we might be able to find some, some headway when it comes to settling trade in INR.
And let's not forget import duty.
Import duty, yeah, again, I think, we seem to have this reputation that India is high on taxes, India is high on excise and custom duties, import restrictions,
on
export restrictions. So again, I think it's important to see on the back of perhaps those IT restrictions that we had imposed on import of finished components or finished products of tablets, laptops, PCs. It didn't augur very well with the Western as well as neighboring countries that we happen to import from. But on the back of that, we are seeing some investment commitments being made by companies like Dixon and companies like Acer, which are likely to set up some sort of a plant, some sort of a manufacturing base here in India to advance their production. And that production is going to be relevant not just for India, but even for them to take advantage of everything that India offers with respect to labor, with respect to capital, with respect to the PLI scheme, take advantage of all these advantages that India offers and therefore use India as a manufacturing base to not just make in India to sell in India, but make in India to sell for the world. So I think these are some of the important influences that India will try to draw out of G20. But remember, G20 still happens to be largely, more of diplomatic or diplomacy in the global economic order. And the number one agenda for the whole world, especially the emerging markets, is this whole reforms of the multilateral development banks, the MDBs. And that is something which I think India is trying to take or assert a leadership position on, that hey, we are the leaders of the global south, and whatever is happening with emerging markets when it comes to the debt burden on them and by way of restructuring that debt is something that India wants to fight on behalf of the emerging markets.
And that will be on the large larger agenda will be discussed over the course of next day and a half, but there will be a series of bilateral meetings, and what we have so far is that Prime Minister Modi will be meeting with leaders of the UK, Japan, Germany, Italy. There are of course a number of trade agreements that we have with these countries. Germany, of course, very solid trade agreements there with Germany as well, one of the largest trade partner of India. Those meetings could also result in substantial churning of trade. Remember, trade is one of the cornerstones of the G20 group. We want to have better trade ties, we want to have better policies, and this is a financial grouping. This essentially is a grouping of countries which wants to have better financial ties with one another. The larger expectations, and let's also understand what's going to be on the larger agenda, apart from talks around crypto regulation, and you briefly also touched on a possibility of MDBs, the multilateral development banks, there is a larger agenda at play, Krishna.
Well, there is definitely, and the grouping itself is based on the top 20 economies of the world. Let's get that straight over here. Economy sort of underlies this grouping in the first place. So definitely trade and economy will be a huge factor in these bilateral meetings. And look at the bilateral meetings. You name a country, all of them are countries which are great, which have been great in trade partners to India. Traditionally speaking, UK, Japan, Germany, these are some of the economies that India has been doing great trade with, exchange in terms of products, goods, services, all kinds of things. So the names of the countries you mentioned tells me that India is means business at G20.
All right, and apart from that, debt distress is also on the agenda, Kartik, and that is on the back of the fact that you want to help countries like Ghana, you want to help Sri Lanka restructure their debt, but in absence of Chinese leadership or Chinese premiership, it's going to be a little difficult.
Exactly. So I think this whole debate around the reforms in multilateral development banks stems from this whole need for relieving the debt distress in emerging economies and economies which are distressed for whatever reasons, internal or external. So the whole debate stems from this need of some North African countries as well as countries in the South Asian pack, which are burdened by a huge debt from these multilateral development banks. And parallelly, you mentioned China, there is this multilateralism with respect to these MDBs, 31 of them, versus unilateralism with China. So China, on its own accord, has pretty much acted in the capacity of these MDBs, giving these soft loans to these emerging economies which are distressed economies right now, and by way of lending to them, trying to take control of their economic assets, be it ports, be it mines, be it any other natural resources that those countries produce. I think China has been instrumental in adding to the debt distress in the emerging markets pack. And the unilateral banks not being able to either undercut China or extend and influence or sweeten the deal for these developing countries, more than what China is offering them. So this whole idea of reforming MDBs comes from this debt distress in emerging markets. Now, let's look at the IMF, for example. Now, US last week had pledged that it is going to invest about $25 billion. And $25 billion is a substantial number. $25 billion more in IMF and World Bank, or either of the two. Okay. So $25 billion coming from US. Other rich economies would also be compelled to swell up that kitty of multilateral development banks. But the issue being that these multilateral development banks are World War II era. They were developed in the 1940s, 1950s at Bretton Woods to help developing economies or underdeveloped economies back then by way of capital infusion for them to develop infrastructure, for them to develop educational institutions, healthcare institutions, etc. But needs of emerging markets today might be a little different.
Absolutely.
So you may have economies in in Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia, etc., which have infrastructure, basic infrastructure laid out, which have basic healthcare, basic education perhaps laid out, but the issue for them would be to let's say get the industry activated and use these investments to have a mining or a manufacturing based setup. Right. So the decision on where to use the money needs to be equally negotiated between the institutions which are lending to them and the countries which are receiving them.
Right, and perhaps not be used as perhaps a tool to control some of these institutions, or control rather some of these countries,
True.
which has been a concern, especially for South Asian economies, where there's the debt seemed to be an instrument to control geopolitics. And since we have set the ball rolling on what could be and what perhaps is on the economic agenda, let's also, Krishna, let's talk about the importance of G20 as a group. Let's talk about the importance of the top 8 countries for that matter, and let's pull up those graphics. We were trying to delve deeper into why this group is important, and has it been made redundant? Is it like a G7? Is it like a BRICS where whether you question you need it or not? Is it like an ASEAN? How is G20 better or different? And it's very surprising, the collective GDP of the top 8 countries of G20 is about 64% of the world GDP. So you're talking about a substantial share there, and India's share almost at 4%.
Right. And going back to the topic G20 that we're talking about, as I would like to reiterate, this grouping is based on economics. We're talking about the top 20 economies of the world. Now, for India and for India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, this is the third global fora that is being part of back to back. There was BRICS, there was ASEAN, now you have G20. And all three, Shweta, are different in their own way. BRICS is a grouping of countries and economies who have reached a certain stage of evolution in their economic growth. They have not fully achieved their potential, but they're still at a very high level in terms of their own evolution as an economy. So where India finds its place. And then you have ASEAN, where India is sort of a leader in the scheme of things, straightforward, because we're leading all these Asian economies. And then you have G20, which is the seat at the high table. And here we are at the master seat at the high table as the president of G20. So to me, this is how I would look at these three different global fora and India's place in them. And yes, all of it will mean that India has to now go from G20 to be a member of the G7. All I'm looking forward to is that all this trade talk, defense ties pushes us in the fastest possible. I'm not putting a timeline on it. India should be a part of G7 and host its presidency next after this.
All right, and you can't put a timeline on it, basically, given the global economic volatility. And of course, we keep talking about the challenges to G20. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges to G20 would be inflation, would be problems around debt. And those will weigh in, and the uncertainty that persists, Krishna.
Even before that, Shweta, we don't have Russia and China, and we keep talking about the same thing, and they've been missing from global fora for the last 1 year, in one way or the other. Xi Jinping is there, there's no Putin. Putin is usually not there. There's too much, and consensus on which side are you going to take between other countries. Okay. You have a problem in the common statement in G20s these days because the Ukraine war has polarized global geopolitics and also divided straight down the middle. You have two sets of people taking sides in two different ways. So hence, these are uncertain times, and I reiterate the cliche, the VUCA world that we live in: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So in this time, at least for 20 nations to come together, to sit on one table and talk itself is a big deal, if you ask me. And these kind of issues will continue happening. But what I would like to see is how the global order gets redrawn. Okay. Like, for example, Kartik was talking about the fact that in the scheme of things, India has been sort of dehyphenating its ties beautifully. We're getting Russian oil, we have ties with Russia, we have ties with China, we have ties with the US. And in that sense, India is sort of doing something that's not being done before. And because of India's size, it is difficult to not look at what India is doing. And probably I would say the world should start taking lessons from India. If this is the size of your economy, if these are the number of people dependent upon you, you've got to get oil from one place or the other. You can't sit and play like, by principle, I'm not going to go here. By principle, I'm not going to go there. You've got to keep economies running. You've got to keep feeding people. You've got to keep roads.
And that has happened.
And that has happened. And that requires a very evolved way of approaching these global fora, these global groupings, as it were. So I think that we are in very, very times which we will become more clear forward when probably the Ukraine war ceases to exist. Then there's more normalcy and sanity in this global fora and global groupings, and greater consensus. With the lack of a greater consensus, the best you can do is what India has been doing. So if you ask me how these global forums work, you've got to take them with a pinch of salt. They'll always be troubled by global factors, wars, difference. Imagine having these global forums during the Cold War days, or imagine having this during the Gulf War days. I'm sure none of them would have been simple. This is Ukraine war. Okay, the war has come to Europe finally, unlike the Gulf wars and other wars that have taken place in Asia.
All right.